In March of 1857, the United States Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, declared that all blacks, slaves as well as free, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. The court also declared the 1820 Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, thus permitting slavery in all the country's territories. The case before the court was that Dred Scott versus Sandford. Dred Scott, a slave who had lived in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin before moving back to the slave state of Missouri, had appealed to the Supreme Court in hopes of being granted his freedom. Taney, a staunch supporter of slavery and intent on protecting Southerners from Northern aggression, wrote in the court's majority opinion that because Scott was black, he could not become a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. The framers of the Constitution, he wrote, believed that blacks had no rights which the white man had bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic, whenever profit could be made by it, referring to the language in the Declaration of Independence that includes the phrase, all men are created equal. Taney reasoned that it is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included, and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. Abolitionists were incensed. Although disappointed, Frederick Douglass found a bright side to the decision and announced, "My hopes were never brighter than now." For Douglass, the decision would bring slavery to the attention of the nation and was a step towards slavery's ultimate destruction. The problem and reason for the case. The controversy began in 1833 when Dr. John Emerson, a surgeon with the U.S. Army, purchased Dred Scott, a slave, and eventually moved Scott to a base in the Wisconsin Territory. Slavery was banned in the territory pursuant to the Missouri Compromise. Whenever Emerson died, the property, Dred Scott and his family, belonged to Emerson's wife, Eliza Irene Sandford. Scott had always known that Missouri was a free state, so he got enough money to buy his and his family's freedom and asked Miss Sandford to sell them back their freedom. Miss Sandford refused. Scott filed a suit against Miss Sandford, but during that time Miss Sandford remarried and left her brother, John Sandford, to deal with her affairs. Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave bought by Dr. John Emerson in 1833. Justice Roger B. Taney. Justice Roger B. Taney was a former slave owner, as were four other Southern justices on the court. The amendment's first section includes several clauses: the Citizenship Clause, Privileges or Immunities Clause, Due Process Clause, and Equal Protection Clause. The Citizenship Clause provides a broad definition of citizenship, overruling the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott versus Sandford, which had held the Americans descended from African slaves could not be citizens of the United States. The Privileges and Immunities Clause has been interpreted in such a way that it does very little. The Due Process Clause prohibits state and local government officials from depriving persons of life, liberty, or property without legislative authorization. This clause has also been used by the federal judiciary to make most of the Bill of Rights applicable to the states, as well as to recognize substantive and procedural requirements that the state laws must satisfy. The Equal Protection Clause requires each state to provide equal protection under the law to all people within its jurisdiction. This clause was the basis for Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision that precipitated the dismantling of racial segregation and for many other decisions rejecting irrational or unnecessary discrimination against people belonging to various groups. Court's decision. Since the Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney was in the favor of helping out the South, he ruled that since Dred Scott used to be a slave, currently was, he could not buy back his freedom. He also said that since he was black, he could not be a citizen, which meant he could not have a fair trial. Reasoning behind the court's decision. Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney was a racist man in favor of slavery and the South. The reason why he ruled what he ruled is because he believed that Mr. Scott was not a citizen or could ever be because he was a black man. This court case has changed the way everyone lives and acts today. Many people were and still are racist. The fact that this case went to the Supreme Court infuriated people that thought racism was wrong. The significance of the court's decision is both good and bad. It is good because it brought the court's decision to people's daily lives, therefore showed how wrong it was of what the decision was. The bad news was what happened to Mr. Scott. This decision has changed today's people's point of view on social